Hey, welcome back. Sometimes history feels like this grand, serious thing. Wars over territory, revolutions for ideals, epic clashes of empires. But every now and then, you stumble across a story that reminds you that history is also deeply, wonderfully human. And by human, I sometimes mean a little bit ridiculous. Imagine, for a moment, you're a veteran. You survived the nightmare of the trenches in World War I. You've seen machine guns, artillery, the full industrial horror of modern warfare. And then, a decade later, your government hands you a machine gun again. Your new enemy? A bird. A very, very large bird. I'm Ibnul J. Farabi, and this is Echoes of the Ancients. Today, we're traveling to the Campion district of Western Australia in 1932 for a conflict so uniquely absurd it has earned its infamous title, the Great Emu War. Now, to call it a war is, of course, a bit of historical humor. But for the wheat farmers struggling in the aftermath of the Great Depression, it was no joke. These ex-soldiers had been given land by the government, a chance to start over by taming the harsh outback and growing wheat. It was backbreaking work, and their livelihoods were hanging by a thread. And then came the emus. Thousands of them. Emus are flightless birds, second only to ostriches in height, standing up to 6 feet tall, solidly built, and capable of running at 30 miles an hour. In 1932, driven by a drought into the more settled agricultural areas, a migrating population of some 20,000 emus discovered a wonderful new source of food and water, the farmers' crops and fences. They would sweep through fields, devouring the wheat, and their powerful legs would kick down the flimsy fences, allowing rabbits to come in and finish the job. The farmers were watching their entire season's work vanish, trampled and eaten by what they described as these feathered tornadoes. Desperate, a delegation of ex-soldier farmers went to the Minister of Defense, Sir George Pierce, and they made a request that, on the surface, made a strange kind of sense. They needed help culling the emu population. They were soldiers. The government had soldiers. And more importantly, the government had machine guns. Could the army possibly spare a few men and a Lewis gun or two? Astonishingly, the minister agreed. He saw it as a way to support the veterans, to test military equipment, and even potentially to secure emu skins for hats for the Australian light horsemen. He set a few conditions. The soldiers would be paid by the Farmers Association, the guns would be used only for emu control, and the whole operation would be a test of the effectiveness of automatic fire against this novel threat. Major G.P.W. Meredith of the Royal Australian Artillery was put in command. The stage was set for a military intervention. The campaign began in November of 1932. Major Meredith, with 2 soldiers, 2 Lewis guns, and 10,000 rounds of ammunition, marched into the Campion district, ready for battle. The first engagement, however, was a lesson in humility. Spotting a flock of about 50 emus, the soldiers set up an ambush near a local dam. As the birds came into range, they opened fire. And the emus, in a move that would define the entire war, simply scattered. They broke into small, sprinting groups, zigzagging across the landscape at incredible speed. The machine guns, designed for the static, massed infantry charges of the Western Front, were almost useless against these fast, dispersed, and unpredictable targets. After a long burst of fire, the soldiers assessed the damage. They had killed perhaps a dozen birds. The rest were gone, vanishing into the scrub. It was an inauspicious start. They tried different tactics. They mounted a Lewis gun on the back of a truck, hoping to chase the emus down. This proved even more futile. The terrain was rough. The truck couldn't keep up with the sprinting birds, and the gunner found it impossible to aim while bouncing over rocks and ruts. The only thing they managed to hit was the truck's own chassis. After a few days, reports began to filter back to the cities. A major city newspaper, the Daily News, ran the now famous headline, "Emu War, Machine Gunners' Failures." Public sentiment, which was initially sympathetic, began to turn. The whole operation was starting to look farcical. Politicians questioned the expense. Conservationists, though not a major force then, raised eyebrows. After about a week, and with an ammunition tally showing around 2,500 rounds fired for a confirmed kill count of maybe 200 emus, Major Meredith was ordered to withdraw. The first campaign was over. The emus had won. But the farmers pleaded again. The emus were still there, ravaging the crops. So, just a few days later, Major Meredith was sent back. This second campaign was more successful in a grim, numerical sense. He adopted a new strategy, setting up ambushes at watering holes, and even reportedly bribing local hunters with emu feathers to act as scouts. Over the next month or so, his unit claimed a kill count of nearly 1,000 emus. But the math was still terrible. By the end, the official report suggested it took about 10 bullets to kill a single emu. The cost per bird was becoming a political embarrassment. In early December, the military was permanently withdrawn. Major Meredith, in his final report, offered a backhanded compliment to his foe. He noted, with a soldier's respect, that the emus were almost invulnerable to machine gun fire. "If we had a military division with the bullet-carrying capacity of these birds," he wrote, "it would face any army in the world." So, what's the real story here, beyond the absurd headline? For me, Ibnul, sitting here in New York and thinking about this from an engineer's perspective, it's a profound lesson in the wrong tool for the job. The Australian government tried to solve an ecological and agricultural problem with a blunt, military instrument. They saw a target and applied the technology they had, without fully understanding the nature of the problem. The emus weren't an army. They were a migratory, adaptive, and highly resilient species. The farmers eventually found a better solution themselves. The government simply instituted a bounty system, paying them directly for emu skins. It was cheaper, more effective, and put the control in the hands of the people who understood the land and the animal. It was a local, scalable solution versus a top-down, overwhelming force. The Great Emu War endures in our memory not because it was a real war, but because it's a perfect, almost mythical, parable of human folly. It's about the hubris of thinking we can conquer nature with sheer force. It's about the disconnect between policymakers in comfortable offices and the messy reality on the ground. And on a lighter note, it's about the undeniable fact that sometimes history is just wonderfully, delightfully silly. It reminds us that our ancestors weren't just statues and names in textbooks. They were people who, every once in a while, found themselves chasing 6-foot-tall birds across the outback with a machine gun, wondering how exactly it had come to this. The emus, of course, are doing just fine. They remain a protected species in Australia, their population stable. They won their war. And we're left with a story that echoes through time, not as a lesson in military strategy, but as a timeless reminder to always, always respect your opponent, especially if your opponent can outrun your truck. If you enjoyed this little detour into the wonderfully strange, I'd be so grateful if you'd share echoes of the ancients with a friend. For more stories from the edges of history, visit our production home at Light Not Studios, lightnotstudios.com. Thanks for listening. Until next time.